All right, so
Huh?
former CEO of WWE,
Right.
nominated to lead the Department of Education.
It's certainly a headline grabber.
It's not. Every day you see a wrestling magnate stepping into the world of textbooks and standardized tests, right?
Yeah, not really.
But it's not just a headline-grabbing moment. It's potentially a turning point in American education, and we're going to unpack exactly how we got here.
You know what I think is really fascinating about this?
What?
This seemingly out of left field nomination actually reveals a lot about the Department of Education itself.
Yeah,
It's had its own share of dramatic twists and turns,
right.
power struggles and ideological battles, just like...
Just like wrestling.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're taking a trip through revisionist history.
Mm-hmm.
I think David McCullough meets Malcolm Gladwell.
Okay.
But with a side of, well, you guessed it, wrestling.
All right. I like where this is going.
We're going to uncover the hidden dramas, the surprising connections, the forces that shaped the department into what it is today, and ultimately try to answer the big question.
Yeah, what's the question?
Can McMahon's experience leading a global entertainment empire translate to leading the vast and complex world of American education?
Now, to do that, we're going to be looking at a couple of sources.
Lay it on me.
We have a biography of Linda McMahon,
Okay.
which traces her journey from a small-town girl in North Carolina to the CEO of a wrestling dynasty.
Right. From those small-town roots to the top of the wrestling world.
And we'll also be looking at an academic analysis of the Department of Education itself.
Gotcha.
Its origins, its near-death experiences, and its rise to becoming a major force in American society.
Okay, so let's start with Linda.
All right.
Now, you might be picturing her in a boardroom, barking orders, negotiating million-dollar contracts.
I mean, that image isn't entirely wrong.
Right.
But her story actually begins far from the glitz and glamour of the wrestling world.
So where does it begin?
She was born Linda Edwards in 1948 in New Bern, North Carolina.
Okay.
And her childhood wasn't exactly a preview of the life she'd lead.
Really? How so?
Well, she was a standout student, particularly excelling in French. Interesting.
Which she went on to study at East Carolina University.
So very different from the world of wrestling.
It's interesting to note that even in her early years, there are hints of the ambition and drive that would come to define her career.
In what way?
She wasn't afraid of hard work pushing boundaries,
Okay.
and that's a theme that echoes throughout her life.
Okay, so she's got this drive, this ambition.
Yes, and then of course there's the moment that changes everything.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
At just 13 years old, she meets Vince McMahon, the future king of the wrestling ring.
Wow, talk about a fateful encounter.
Their story is almost Shakespearean in its scope. You have the young love, the early struggles, a meteoric rise to power.
Right.
They married young, faced financial hardship, even filed for bankruptcy at one point.
Bankruptcy.
It's a stark contrast to the image of the billionaire power couple we know today.
That is a huge contrast. I mean, bankruptcy, that's tough.
It really speaks to their resilience, their determination to overcome those early setbacks and build something extraordinary.
So they poured their energy into Titan Sports, which would eventually become the global phenomenon we know as WWE.
WWE and Linda's role in that transformation.
Crucial.
How so?
She became CEO in 1997 and for over a decade steered the company to new heights.
I mean, it's interesting, though, because her leadership style was very different from Vince's.
How so?
He was the charismatic showman, the face of the company, right?
Right.
But she was the strategic mind behind the scenes, the one focused on the nuts and bolts of building a business empire.
Yeah, she was meticulous, detail-oriented, a stark contrast to Vince's more flamboyant personality.
And, I mean, that's got to be tough.
Right? What do you mean?
I mean, being a woman in that world, in that industry.
Right, yeah, absolutely. What's remarkable is that she thrived in a male-dominated industry,
Right.
a world that at the time wasn't exactly welcoming to women in leadership positions.
So we see this pattern emerging, someone who's not afraid to break barriers,
Right.
to challenge expectations, to succeed in environments where others might have faltered.
And that leads us to the next chapter of her story,
Okay, let's hear it.
her transition into public service.
Public service. So how does that start?
It begins with an appointment to the Connecticut Board of Education.
Oh, interesting.
A hint, perhaps, of the path she would eventually take.
It's almost like foreshadowing, isn't it?
Yeah, kind of like she was testing the waters of the education world
Then she runs for Senate.
in 2010 and 2012.
Right.
Although unsuccessful, they demonstrate a continued willingness to step into the political arena.
And then, of course,
Her role as administrator of the Small Business Administration under President Trump.
Yeah, talk about a diverse resume.
It's like she's constantly pushing herself outside of her comfort zone, taking on new challenges, proving that she can adapt and thrive in a variety of settings.
But how does all of this prepare someone for leading the Department of Education?
Well, to understand that, we need to shift our focus from Linda's personal journey to the evolution of the department itself.
Okay.
And it's a history that's just as unexpected and, dare I say, entertaining as a WWE match.
All right, so let's rewind the clock way back. I mean, the Department of Education, as we know it, was established in 1979.
Right.
But the idea of a federal role in education that goes back centuries.
Exactly. The roots can be traced all the way back to the late 18th century with the land ordinances.
Land ordinances.
Essentially, the government was setting aside land specifically for public schools.
Wow.
It was a revolutionary idea at the time, a recognition that education wasn't just a private matter, but a public good, something essential for the nation's future.
It's amazing to think how forward-thinking that was for its time. I mean, back then, education was primarily seen as a local or family responsibility.
But the idea of federal involvement was still contentious. The Constitution itself left education primarily to the states.
Right.
And there was a lot of debate about how much power the federal government should have in this realm.
And that tension, that push and pull between federal oversight and local control.
Yes.
That's a theme that runs throughout the entire history of the Department of Education right up to the present day.
Absolutely. It's a constant struggle to find that balance, and it's played out in some pretty dramatic ways over the years.
So give us the highlights. What are some of the key turning points in the department's history?
Well, we have the creation of the first Department of Education in 1867. Sounds like a victory, right?
Yeah, you would think so.
But wait, a year later, it gets demoted to an office within the Department of the Interior.
Talk about a short-lived reign. What happened there?
It was a sign at the times there was a deep-seated fear of federal overreach, a belief that education should be left to the states.
Okay, but that fear didn't completely squash the idea of a national role in education, right?
No, the seeds had been planted, and they would eventually sprout, albeit slowly and with plenty of resistance along the way.
So we have this early tug of war between federal involvement and local control. What were some of the key events that shifted the balance of power?
Well, fast forward to the 20th century, and we have a series of events that dramatically reshape the educational landscape.
Like what?
First, the Cold War and the anxieties surrounding Sputnik.
Sputnik.
Suddenly, education became a matter of national security.
It's incredible how fear can be such a powerful driver of change.
Absolutely. The U.S. felt like it was falling behind in the space race, and the government responded with the National Defense Education Act of 1958, pumping money into science, math, and foreign languages.
So the Cold War essentially forced the federal government to take a more active role in education.
Exactly, and that trend continued with the social upheavals of the 1960s.
Right.
Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, especially the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, were landmark pieces of legislation aimed at addressing inequality and ensuring that all students had access to a quality education, regardless of their background.
So we're seeing the federal role in education expanding, but it still wasn't a cabinet-level department.
Correct. It took another major push this time from President Jimmy Carter,
Oh, yeah.
who made it a campaign promise to establish a separate Department of Education.
And in 1979.
He fulfilled that promise, creating the department as we know it today.
So that brings us to the modern era of the Department of Education. But even then, it wasn't smooth sailing.
Not at all. The debate over federal involvement raged on conservatives, saw the new department as a bureaucratic behemoth, a threat to local control and traditional values, and they weren't afraid to voice their opposition.
Yeah, and it's amazing how some of those same arguments are still being made today. The battle over the role of the federal government in education, it seems like it never really ends.
It's a fundamental tension in American society, and it's played out in fascinating ways throughout the department's history.
So we've covered Linda McMahon's unconventional path to this nomination.
Yeah.
And the Department of Education's own roller coaster ride through history.
Yeah.
But the big question remains, can her experience translate to leading this massive agency?
That's what we'll explore next. We'll delve into the specific challenges facing the department today and analyze how McMahon's background might or might not equip her to handle them.
Sounds good.
So we left off with that big question.
Right. Can Linda McMahon's experience translate to leading the Department of Education?
It's a question that's sparking debates all over the country.
It really is. I mean, can the strategies you use to build a wrestling empire really apply to the world of education policy?
Right. It's a fascinating puzzle.
It is. It's so to even begin to answer that.
Well, we need to understand the very specific challenges facing the department right now.
Okay, so let's talk challenges. What are the biggest ones on the department's plate right now?
Well, the list is long, but a major one that keeps coming up is educational inequality. And honestly, the pandemic really threw gasoline on that fire.
Yeah, it definitely exposed the cracks in the system, didn't it? Things like the digital divide, the huge differences in resources between schools,
Right.
and how unprepared we were to handle a sudden shift to remote learning.
Exactly. So whoever steps into the role of Secretary of Education is going to have to grapple with closing those gaps,
Right.
making sure that every student, no matter where they live or what their background is, has a shot at a quality education.
And that's a lot more complicated than just throwing money at the problem.
Oh, you got it. It's about understanding the deep-rooted systemic issues at play.
So, like, what kinds of things?
We're talking about tackling teacher shortages in under-resourced communities, providing adequate support for students with disabilities, and ensuring that the curriculum is actually engaging and relevant to students from diverse backgrounds.
So let's connect this back to Linda McMahon. Does anything in her background suggest she's ready to tackle a challenge this complex?
Well, her time leading the Small Business Administration might offer some clues.
Okay, in what way?
Her focus there was on streamlining operations, making it easier for businesses to access resources, and really advocating for underserved communities, especially women entrepreneurs and veterans.
Okay, I see the potential connection there, but running a government agency is a whole different animal from running a business, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us to another major challenge the department faces, navigating the political minefield that is education policy. It's constantly under scrutiny from both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, it's like a never-ending political battleground.
Right.
Every administration comes in wanting to leave its mark on education, and that can lead to a lot of back and forth, which isn't always helpful for students and teachers on the ground.
It's true. Think about the debates over standardized testing, Common Core school choice.
Right.
These are incredibly polarizing issues, and any Secretary of Education is going to face intense pressure from all sorts of interest groups.
So how do you think someone like McMahon, with her background, would handle that pressure cooker? I mean, she's not a stranger to politics.
Right. She has run for office and served in a presidential administration, so she's comfortable in those circles. But the Department of Education is a unique beast.
In what way?
It has this dual role. It's responsible for implementing national policies, which can be a huge undertaking in itself, but it also has to work hand in hand with states and local school districts, which have a lot of autonomy.
So it's like walking a tightrope.
Right.
Finding that balance between federal oversight and respecting local control, that can't be easy.
Not at all, especially when you factor in all the passionate stakeholders involved, parents, teachers, unions, advocacy groups. They all have a voice in the education system, and they don't always agree.
It sounds like McMahon would need more than just business smarts and political savvy to succeed in this role.
Absolutely. She'd need to show a deep understanding of how American education actually works, the historical context, the current problems, the different viewpoints in play, and a real ability to build consensus.
Right, she'd have to bring all those competing interests together, which is no easy feat. Okay, so let's play devil's advocate for a moment. Let's say McMahon is confirmed. What might her leadership look like? Are there clues we can take from her past?
Well, if we look back at her time at the SBA, she might focus on streamlining the department's operations, making it more efficient, more responsive to the needs of students, teachers, and schools.
So it's almost like applying a business mindset to government bureaucracy.
You could say that she might also push for deregulation, giving states and local districts more freedom in how they spend federal money and implement programs.
I can see that appealing to those who advocate for more local control. It aligns with a lot of the conservative criticisms of the department having too much power. But wouldn't that raise concerns about fairness?
How so?
If districts have more freedom to spend money, wouldn't that end up benefiting wealthier districts more?
That's a valid concern. If McMahon went down this path, she would have to show how her approach would ensure that resources and opportunities are distributed equitably. And honestly, a lot of people are skeptical about whether she can do that.
So at this point, it's all speculation.
Right.
We're just trying to connect the dots based on her past actions.
Exactly. We'll just have to wait and see what unfolds.
Okay, so what does this all mean for the future of American education? I mean, it feels like we're in uncharted territory here.
We are. In many ways, McMahon's nomination represents a real break from tradition, and it hints at a possible shift in priorities for the department, and that has a lot of people worried, excited, and everything in between.
Yeah, this is going to be fascinating to watch unfold.
It really is, and we'll be here to break it all down for you every step of the way now to get a clearer picture of what McMahon's potential leadership might look like. We need to zoom in on some of the most pressing issues facing education today.
Right. And there's some big ones. Standardized testing, school choice, the digital divide,
Yeah.
the push for more equitable funding.
Yeah.
These are all incredibly complex issues that have been debated for years. So let's dive into those next.
Okay, so we've traced Linda McMahon's path from the wrestling ring to a presidential nomination.
Right.
We've explored the Department of Education's own tumultuous history.
Yes.
But now let's get down to brass tacks. How might McMahon's approach actually play out on some of the biggest issues in education today?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question, and there are some real head-scratchers to consider.
Okay, such as?
Let's start with something that's been a political football for decades, standardized testing. Will she be a champion of the status quo, or might she shake things up?
I mean, it's such a divisive issue.
It really is. You have supporters who say these tests are essential for accountability.
Yeah.
They measure progress, they identify areas for improvement, and help ensure that schools are actually doing their jobs.
Right.
But then you have critics who say that these tests are too narrow, they put way too much pressure on teachers and students,
Uh-huh.
and that they don't really capture the complexity of learning. It's like trying to measure a child's intelligence with a single ruler.
Yeah, and we can't forget the concerns about cultural bias in these tests.
Right. It's just a very complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah.
So where might someone like McMahon land on this spectrum?
Well, her business background might suggest a data-driven approach, right?
Yeah.
Maybe she'd double down on standardized testing, seeing it as a way to get those hard numbers,
Right.
to track performance and make decisions based on measurable outcomes.
It makes sense.
But on the other hand, she
Mhm.
also talked a lot about deregulation and giving more power back to local communities.
Right.
So it's not out of the realm of possibility that she might actually take a more hands-off approach.
Right. Giving states and districts more flexibility in how they assess student learning.
Interesting. So maybe a shift away from those high-stakes standardized tests towards more localized assessments, things like portfolio-based evaluations, project-based learning approaches that give a more well-rounded picture of what students are actually learning.
Yeah. It's certainly conceivable. She might even advocate for a more holistic approach to evaluation, one that considers factors beyond just test scores,
Such as?
things like student engagement, social emotional learning, and even community involvement.
Okay, so that would be a pretty major departure from the No Child Left Behind era.
It would be.
Okay, so let's move on to another hot button issue, school choice. We're talking charter schools, vouchers, the whole debate about public versus private education. Where might McMahon fall on that spectrum?
Well, if we look at her past, she's been a strong advocate for free market principles for individual empowerment, for the idea that competition drives innovation.
So she might be sympathetic to school choice initiatives.
Yes, possibly. Maybe push for expanding charter schools, giving parents more options for where to send their kids.
It wouldn't be surprising, but remember, she's also expressed a commitment to serving underserved communities.
Right.
And that raises some thorny questions about equity and access when it comes to school choice.
Yeah, that's the big criticism of school choice, isn't it?
It is.
That it can end up draining resources from public schools, leaving behind the students who need the most support.
Exactly. So if McMahon goes down this path, she'll have to address those concerns head on,
Right.
How can school choice be implemented in a way that's truly fair, that doesn't just widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots? It's a tough question, and one that a lot of people will be watching closely.
So no matter what she does,
Yeah.
it sounds like her leadership could have a huge impact, for better or for worse.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. This nomination is a potential turning point for American education. And it's a reminder that the Department of Education, despite all the controversy surrounding it, holds a lot of power.
Yeah.
It has the potential to shape the lives of millions of students across the country.
It's a heavy responsibility.
It really is. And as we've seen today, the historical baggage, the political pressure, the sheer complexity of the challenges facing the department,
Yeah.
it's a daunting task for anyone.
It is. So as we wrap up, what's the most important takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as this story continues to unfold?
I'd say this: pay attention, watch closely, ask questions. This isn't just about one person.
Right.
It's about the future direction of American education. Will it be a course correction, a doubling down on existing policies, or something completely unexpected? That's what we'll be exploring together as this story unfolds.
Well said, and that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Linda McMahon's nomination and the Department of Education.
Of course.
We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.